This is Dr. Paul Hamilton, and this is Dr. Sam Gilchrist Hull. And welcome. We are going to be discussing today The Lame Shall Enter First by Flannery O'Connor. So we are The Lame Shall Enter First is a short story that was written it was published originally in 1962 by Flannery O'Connor, just a couple of years before her death, and then later on it was published in her book of short stories, Everything That Rises Must Converge, in 1965. The story is about a man named Sheppard who is mourning the loss of his wife. She's died for about a year prior, and as part of that mourning process, he volunteers at a local reform school and tries to help troubled kids. And he has a son, so obviously his wife is dead, but he has a son named Norton who's 11, and his son Norton is also terribly, grief-stricken over his mother's death. It's been a year. He's still quite grief-stricken and traumatized by his mother's death. And Sheppard sort of deals with his loss by doing this kind of volunteer work. Sheppard gets interested in helping a kid named Rufus Johnson, who he meets at the reform school, who comes from a really seriously impoverished background, but he is, according to Sheppard, a kind of genius, and he thinks that he has a ton of potential. And so the story is really about how Sheppard tries to reform Rufus and fails to do that, and meanwhile really seriously damaging his relationship with his son. And so, I mean, there's a number of different, themes that, emerge from this. One is grief. The other is, that Sheppard's, is clearly, according to Flannery O'Connor, adopts a kind of Enlightenment view of human psychology. And he's continually rationalizing Rufus's behavior and motives. And that is sort of set up against a kind of Dark Ages view, or a kind of medieval religious view that, is drawn from the context in the South, the kind of evangelical holy rollers view of religion, where Satan features very prominently and is used to describe all kinds of behavior. And so Sheppard's attempt to reform Rufus, and really the power struggle that ensues, is you could see it under that rubric of the Enlightenment versus kind of a dark kind of extreme Pentecostal version of Christianity in which evil features very prominently. Sheppard sort of rejects evil, and so the question of grief, the Enlightenment, religion, the nature of evil, these are all topics that come up. And I mean, I think that lastly, we could discuss it in terms of a tragedy. There are some features of the story that fit the kind of a tragic trajectory, and also the moral law, whether or not there is moral certainty. Religion obviously suggests that there is, but how do we process that? So
yes, I'd like to just come in there with this idea of certainty, because I think that one of the things we've been talking about a great deal in these podcasts is about this idea of what is it that makes a particular literary work good or great. And I think, so as you know, and I think as I've mentioned even on here, I always view literature as an intrinsically ambiguous form. So the thing for me that is interesting about literature, say, in contrast to some degree to theology or history, is that there isn't really a clear sense of right and wrong necessarily. And this question is really, really apparent in a very elegantly simplistic way in this story. So the basic question that I think animates a lot of literature and a lot of our thinking about literature, why we become fascinated by literary works, is who is right? Now, when we apply this to The Lame Shall Enter first, who is right? Well, clearly not Rufus, although he is perhaps the most perceptive of characters. Clearly not Sheppard, clearly not his son, so who is correct? Who is right here? Which view of the world is less twisted than the other? And I think the key thing with this is that actually it offers an image of two completely twisted worldviews. The first being this kind of, arguably at least, a kind of Enlightenment viewpoint, or a atheistic, strongly humanist viewpoint. And something I'd love to talk about in a different podcast would be, what do we mean by humanism? As you know, it's a theme of my book. And on the other side, this kind of bizarre Pentecostal Christianity that focuses especially on sin. And it's worth, of course, noting that this is in no way representative of the vast majority of kind of Christian believers. It's a deliberately extreme form. So both of these positions the novel seems to show as being ultimately untenable, which I think is very good. It shows that, neither of the main protagonists is correct.
Yeah, and I mean, you said twisted, and I think that this is, before I respond, I think it's important that I'd forgotten to explain that Rufus is crippled. He's handicapped, and he especially has this twisted leg and foot, and hence the title, "The Lame Shall Enter First." And that becomes both an object, symbolic, an object of sympathy, and a project for Sheppard, and also a psychological explanation, like with in Shakespeare's Richard III, somehow for his evil. But yeah, I mean, I think that, like you said, I mean, there's these two dynamic, forces at work, and one is a sort of extreme version of Christianity, and another is this Enlightenment view, and this attempt to explain human behavior from this rationalistic, Enlightenment viewpoint, and like you said, that O'Connor seems to suggest that both are impotent in a certain way, or that both, come up short. And so her irony is really to show the ways that Sheppard's, Enlightenment view just utterly blinds him to the forces that he encounters with the dark forces that he encounters with Rufus. Is just his evil. You could call it sociopathy, or you could call it his. He gets into a power struggle with Sheppard, and in that power struggle, Rufus does not have any. He doesn't care who he hurts in that power struggle. He just wants to win. But I mean, I'm not sure. Sheppard is, has the more sort of socially acceptable side of that dynamic. But his, O'Connor makes it very clear that he, it's about domination. He said, he wants to save him against his will. He wants to break him. And,
yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to come in there into your discussion of the foot, because I think that that's important. And I thought we just quickly could look at two short quotations from the text which describe Rufus's foot, or more specifically the shoe. So we've talked, obviously, one thing that makes sort of certain works of literature maybe better than others is to do with their kind of interesting ambiguity, or the complexities within the text, such as we said, who is right. This is one thing. Another thing is, of course, the poetic features. And one of the things I found really arresting about Flannery O'Connor was her use of simile. So her use of as or like. For instance, she describes so she's describing the old shoe that Rufus wears before and indeed afterwards, after he gets a new one. And he's got this horrible boot, because he's been neglected, he's got this horrible boot that doesn't fit his badly clubbed foot. And it's got a hole in it, and there's a hole, and there's this white sock or bandage sticking out. And she describes it as like this. So if you imagine this foot with a bit of white socks sticking out of this huge kind of bulbous shoe, and she describes it as like this patch of cloth as being like a grey tongue from a severed head. And immediately there's this image, I suppose, of, John the Baptist's head, among other things.
Yeah,
and it's just such a beautiful way, and such an unusual way of describing it. It's as if the grey tongue is as if the tongue is being stuck out at kind of reasonable, polite society, at Sheppard, at everything that Sheppard stands for. This tongue is being stuck out. And why is it a grey tongue? Well, maybe it's because, Rufus's death drive is so extraordinary for one so young. He seems to live almost in some kind of Gnostic universe, in which the universe is constantly attacking him, and it's really inconsequential whether he lives or dies or what conditions he lives in. So he is an example of an extremely alienated, distressed young man. And then there's another nice description when they're in the shoe shop, and Sheppard takes him to this special shop for equipment for people who have disabilities of various sorts. And there's a very vibrant description of all the different kind of braces and crutches and wheelchairs and things that are sold in the shop, which I loved. And then there's a description of the clerk of the shop taking off Rufus's old shoe to measure him for his new one. And again, it's using this simile form. And he says he removed the old shoe as if he were skinning an animal still half alive.
Jesus, yeah, that's incredible. Incredible, yeah, absolutely incredible. Why don't I read as well the section that you were talking about the description of the shop, which I think is incredible as well. The brace shop was a small concrete warehouse lined and stacked with the equipment of affliction. Wheelchairs and walkers covered most of the floor. The walls were hung with every kind of crutch and brace. Artificial limbs were stacked on the shelves, legs and arms and hands, claws and hooks, straps and human harnesses, and unidentifiable instruments for unnamed deformities. The instruments, what does she say? She calls it the equipment of affliction. It's just such a, and I mean, again, you're talking about you could talk about the leg and the foot as like a symbol on the one hand, On the other hand, I mean, this is, incredibly evocative, without necessarily, I mean, you can reduce it to a symbol and say, to some extent, the foot becomes his kind of, an expression of his, like you said, the gray tongue, what that aspect of life that Sheppard cannot accept, that is not accounted for in a rationalistic view of things. I think that, when you just can consider, for example, voting patterns, when pollsters and political scientists study voting patterns, oftentimes they think about rational self-interest. Their theory is rational self-interest, and they have this idea that everybody, that the populace, is voting along these sort of through a series of preferences. But and that certainly explains some aspect of it, but it does not explain like the libidinal force of populist energy.
Yes, I'm not sure. I would probably disagree with you there. I don't think it explains anything. I mean, it's a psychological fact that motivation is emotional, not rational. So you can show people all the numbers and statistics you like. You're not going to persuade them. And there's this great, again, this is something perhaps you talk about in in your video lessons on Julius Caesar. You see, shamelessly plugging them. Is this difference between pathos and logos? So the difference between Brutus's speech in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar and Mark Antony's speech. One of the speeches is highly emotional and appeals to the audience's emotions. The other provides a series of decent, logical, well-supported arguments. And it's the emotional argument that wins out. And we see this in contemporary politics time and time again. And this is, as I said, because motivation is something that is emotional. There's another kind of thing I thought that was interesting that's slightly related to this, and perhaps you can help me out here, because I've not been making good notes, and I can't work out if I've written down a quotation or an opinion. But there is an idea, I think, in the novel, and tell me if I'm quoting it or not. The short story, I should say, that evil is simplicity, whereas good is complex.
Right. Yeah. That's your.
Is that from the text?
I think that's your analysis of it. Yeah.
That's my analysis. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So good. Right.
But I think it's perfectly valid, in the context. Yeah, absolutely.
But this is intriguing, because normally we think of it being the other way around, don't we? So we think of, say the Garden of Eden or whatever, of Satan tempting Eve through giving her the fruit of the tree of wisdom. So through giving her basically a complicated life. And, we think of essentially evil as being something that's kind of a result of human complexities. And good as being this very simple category. I think what's remarkable here, and this is a really big intellectual move, that O'Connor seems to tip this on a head and say, no, to live in this world, it's exceptionally difficult to be good. How, especially in this kind of, enlightened society, or an atheistic society, whatever you'd want to call it, it's very difficult to navigate what is good behavior. And the other question, getting back to ideas of motivation, is what is Sheppard's motivation for this good behavior? Does the end justify the means, or do we actually, when we exist in a secular society, do we have to think, what is motivating me to behave well here? What is motivating me to be good? Um, and I don't know if she comes up with an answer for that, but what's remarkable is that she seems to associate goodness with a kind of moral complexity and insurmountable ambiguity, ultimately, whereas evil, in the form of Rufus, is very simple. He wants to destroy everything. He wants to dominate and destroy, and that's it.
I mean, I think that, we talk about, I think that, we need to talk about grief, and we need to talk about Norton in order to get to Sheppard's motivation. And I think that it's, I'm not, there are hints about that Sheppard is grief-stricken over his wife's death. So, for example, when Rufus first appears, we see that we first learn that he has left her bedroom exactly intact as it was. It's been a year, and so he criticizes Norton at the beginning and saying that he's too soft, that he's too, he's being self-indulgent and selfish by still clinging to his mother's death. But he himself has left the room exactly as it was. We also find out that there's this incredible line here. So, I mean, it's incredible passage when Norton, when Rufus first enters the house, and encounters Norton without Sheppard there. And in that encounter, Rufus takes Norton's mother's comb and starts messing around with it. And he says, Norton says to Rufus, "Leave her comb alone," the child said. He stood in the door, pale and breathing heavily as if you were watching sacrilege in a holy place. Johnson put the comb down and picked up the brush and gave his hair a swipe with it. "She's dead," the child said. "I ain't afraid of dead people's things," Johnson said. He opened the top drawer and slid his hands in. "Take your big, fat, dirty hands off my mother's clothes," the child said in a high, suffocated voice. "Keep your shirt on, sweetheart," Johnson murmured. He pulled up a wrinkled red polka dot blouse and dropped it back. Then he pulled out a green silk handkerchief. So he's rifling through all his mother's stuff. And which is just, I mean, immediately lets you understand how messed up this kid is. And he immediately finds the wound and, pours battery acid on it, and it's the way that he messes up houses. I mean, one of his things, he leaves people's houses like a train wreck is what the police say about what he does with his vandalism. But this is much better because than just messing up some anonymous person's house, because he can then, because he's so intelligent, he understands exactly where the wound is, and then he can twist it around. Then after this, then there's a really crucial moment where Sheppard comes home and Norton tells him that he's been messing with his mom's stuff, and Sheppard basically just takes Rufus aside. He says, something to the effect of, "I'm not here to, all you can do is tattle on him, and we're not here to judge him. We're here to welcome him," and in this sort of standard kind of moralizing adult tone on the one hand, but on the other hand, the fact that he is not paying attention to how Rufus has desecrated what for Norton is a sacred place is really disturbing. And then this progresses to the point where we find out in the next scene that through Sheppard's consciousness, basically, what he has done when Rufus has actually moved in. So he says, Sheppard glanced across the room at the child. He was sitting on the floor against a trunk trussed up in a rope he had found and wound around his legs from his ankles to his knees. He appeared so far away that Sheppard might have been looking at him through the wrong end of a telescope. His own son appears far. He had had to whip him only once since Johnson had been with them. The first night when Norton had realized that Johnson was going to sleep in his mother's bed. He then cried, and Sheppard whipped him for crying because and protesting because his mother had because Rufus Johnson had slept in his mother's bed. He did not believe in whipping children, particularly in anger. In this case, he had done both, and with good results. He had had no more trouble with Norton. So, I mean, in other words, this is absolutely, I mean, although this Enlightenment guy, you know, he has this project of enlightenment, but he's absolutely brutal. There's this brutality really towards his son and a complete callousness and lack of sensitivity. And I think that, so I was saying, when you look at Norton's motivation, I mean, when you look at Sheppard's motivation, like on the one hand, he stands for Enlightenment thought. On the other hand, there is a lot going on. One is grief, and I'm not sure to what extent that is, but the most prominent thing that we see is his desire to replace his own son with somebody not happy with his son. He starts off by, but in the things that he's critical about his son for is that, like, basically he's not ethical enough, but it's basically is it that his son reminds him of his wife, and so he wants to displace him or what? But I mean, I think that one of the primal kinds of forces is, number one, I think that, probably everybody who's taught or who's been a parent, has that, knows what it's like, that there's like the protege who, resonates with you. And then there's students or kids that don't, or that resist you in different ways. And, it's that primal need to kind of, he just, because he doesn't really get Norton, he wants to replace him. And I think that from Norton's point of view, it's like there's almost a fairy tale element where the double appears, who's going to be your replacement. If you're a child, suddenly this kind of this evil, figure appears who is his replacement, and he's better, he's smarter than Norton. He's he is his father certainly only sees Rufus and doesn't see Norton. I mean, at really, really critical times. And so I think that, so like on the one hand, you have this kind of Enlightenment project to sort of reform Rufus, and this kind of dichotomy between the Enlightenment and sort of the irrational forces, and we were talking about, the sort of political analysts who try to understand people from this Enlightenment point of view. But at the same time, you have these very deeply monstrously selfish motivations. And you see Sheppard really exercising kind of, casual brutality that he rationalizes with this kind of Enlightenment, kind of paternalistic Enlightenment voice. And that, it just makes you really angry at him. Like, how could he just so casually, walk over his own son and disregard his feelings about his mother's death that way? It seems really monstrous. but he's
It
obsessed.
does.
Yeah.
It does. I mean, the only thing I think there are three things that I would say in response to that. The first is that Norton is not the only child without a mother. Right, Rufus lacks both a mother and a father, and I can't quite remember the story there. But so, and there's this kind of strange social hypocrisy whereby it's a tragedy if a middle class kid loses their mother, but if a working class kid loses their mother, well, it's it's part of the course. So that's one thing. And I would say the other thing is that the presence of Rufus puts these, I think maybe enlightenment's the wrong word. I've got nothing against the Enlightenment, actually, but it puts his values, these kind of secular values, it offers a kind of reductio ad absurdum of them, doesn't it? Because if we think of the two things outside of in a kind of secular intelligent society, what's valued? Well, intelligence. Rufus, mathematically, he's done the IQ test, and it's been shown that his IQ is very, very high. That's one thing that is considered. The other thing, I suppose, is his potential to move from one place to another. Whereas the Sheppard's boy could only ever really continue doing what Sheppard did or move in that kind of middle-class milieu, Rufus can be a story. He can be an inspirational speaker in a TED Talk in today's terms. That's the second thing I want to say. Third thing I wanted to say is that because he's smart, he strikes at the heart of the society that he feels alienated from. And that's the kind of sacred space of other people's homes. And he invades them and smashes and destroys things. And this, in a sense, although you're right, you describe it as being libidinal, I think at the same time, in a sense, it's rational, right? Because he's attacking. And if we think of one of the prominent theories of Lacan is that we feel envy of other people when we feel that they have stolen our happiness. Okay, and this is obviously what Rufus feels deep down somewhere, that these people who have their nice houses and so forth have stolen, somehow taken his like there's a finite amount of happiness in the world and they've taken his away from him, and so he wants to attack it. Okay, so here Flannery O'Connor presents the fact that motivation is emotional in Rufus, an otherwise very rational and calculating character. So this is one of the things I think literature is truly great at, and there's a expression that Bertolt Brecht, the famous German poet, is credited with saying, which is that the poets always knew. And here we can see Flannery O'Connor knows all of this stuff intuitively. That within this story there is this knowledge of what motivates us and how even the seemingly irrational or incongruous actions of otherwise highly intelligent people can be explained.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that and Rufus himself, though, explains his, and it's never clear to me, if he's, because he is the most intelligent character in the play, and so his language is slippery. Do we really believe Rufus's explanations for his action or his behavior? I mean, he specifically says, "I'm possessed by Satan, and at some point Jesus will save me, but only when Jesus wants to save me." And then what's weird is that sort of at the climax of the story, Sheppard adopts Rufus's form of explanation for what's happened, and his kind of and basically, I mean, let me remind us what this language is that he uses at this kind of moment. So when the police finally come to pick up Rufus, I mean, O'Connor keeps referring to him as Johnson, but his name is Rufus Johnson. I think Sheppard refers to him as Johnson because he doesn't want to use his first name, which somehow evokes the color red, which is, probably, given the Christian, context, some kind of satanic allusion. So it is a bit confusing. Is he Johnson or he's Rufus Johnson? But and Sheppard wants him to be Johnson. He doesn't want him to be Rufus. But when Sheppard encounters the reporters, and then Rufus basically unleashes on him, he basically and accuses him of immorality, and it's not really clear what immorality he's accusing him of. Sheppard tries to explain his own, to justify himself, and basically he says, "I have nothing to reproach myself with. I have nothing to reproach myself with. I did more for him than I did for my own child." He was struck with a sudden panic. He heard the boy's jubilant voice. "Satan has you in his power." Yeah. So it's like suddenly he's become contaminated. Rufus has already converted Norton, only this kind of perverted kind of form of Christianity where somehow he can be with his mother by launching himself into space, by hanging him, by committing suicide. But he seems to be converting Sheppard here. "I have nothing to reproach myself with," he began again. "I did more for him than I did for my own child." He heard his voice as if it were the voice of his accuser. And of course, we know Satan is referred to as the accuser. He repeated the sentence silently. Slowly, his face drained of color. It became almost gray beneath the white halo of his hair, reminding again of that tongue sticking. The sentence echoed in his mind, each syllable like a dull blow. His mouth twisted and he closed his eyes against the revelation. Norton's face rose before him, empty, forlorn, his left eye listing almost imperceptibly towards the outer rim as if it could not bear a full view of grief. His heart constricted with a repulsion for himself so clear in intensity, gasped for breath. He had stuffed his own emptiness with good works like a glutton. He had ignored his own child to feed his vision of himself. He saw the clear-eyed devil, the sounder of hearts, leering at him from the eyes of Johnson. His image of himself shriveled until everything was black before him. He sat there paralyzed. And then I'll just read the last two paragraphs here because it connects that with Norton. He saw Norton at the telescope, all back and ears, saw his arms shoot up and wave frantically. A rush of agonizing love for the child rushed over him like a transfusion of life. The little boy's face appeared to him transformed, the image of his salvation, all light. He groaned with joy. He could make everything up to him. He would never let him suffer again. He would be mother and father. He jumped up and ran to his room to kiss him, to tell him that he loved him, that he would never fail him again. The light was on in Norton's room, but the bed was empty. He turned and dashed up the attic stairs, and at the top, reeled back like a man on the edge of a pit. The tripod had fallen, and the telescope lay on the floor a few feet above it. The child hung in the jungle of shadows just below the beam from which he had launched his flight into space. And so you have, I think Sheppard really infected by this idea, by Rufus, really, by this idea that what he has done has been that he has been possessed by the devil in some way.
And sorry to interject just quickly.
Yeah.
This, because I noted this use of the expression a jungle of shadows surrounded the child is used 4 times.
Oh, really?
Both to describe Rufus and to describe Norton, and then this is the final usage of it. This idea of a jungle of shadows.
That's and yeah, it's a fascinating image, actually. The jungle of and I mean, there's also this really creepy moment too, when Sheppard comes in and he sees Rufus and Norton on the couch together, he stepped. This is earlier. He stopped in the hall and looked silently into the room. His expectant expression faded. His face seemed suddenly as old as his white hair. The 2 boys were sitting close together on the sofa, reading the same book. Norton's cheek rested against the sleeve of Johnson's black suit. Johnson's now wearing this black suit, like this formal black suit. Johnson's finger moved under the lines they were reading, the elder brother and the younger. Sheppard looked woodenly at this scene for almost a minute. Then he walked into the room and took off his coat. This is after neither boy noticed him. This is after Sheppard realizes that Johnson has been lying to him. Rufus has been lying to him, and that he has been doing these. And he does somehow. He still doesn't really understand. I mean, it's creepy. He seems a little bit creeped out, but like he doesn't fully comprehend that Rufus has fully infiltrated into Norton's emotional life. And you were talking before, there's a really interesting and telling moment when on the one hand, Rufus is spouting all this stuff about, your mother's in heaven, right? And asking Norton, was she saved, and if she's saved, then she's in heaven. And at the same time, Sheppard is going on about like how, isn't it amazing that creatures, emerged out of the ooze, and somehow surged to life. And you realize that Sheppard cannot answer the questions that Norton has about his mother, and that his whole worldview is completely incapable of answering those questions, and that he simply cannot enter onto this realm of higher intensity that accounts for lived experience.
And it's also it's a world without metaphysics that he has, that it's one where scientific explanation is everything, which I think is very, very telling indeed.
But you talk about the shadows, right? I mean, that's the untamable kind of luxurious growth that he can't. And there's another point where Rufus describes his own foot as being kind of a luxurious growth that and he's happy that the guy can't that it seems to have grown on its own, and the guy has misfit the shoe, that somehow have a mind of its own and has this kind of expansive kind of growth of primeval energy.
Yes, and of course it has a tongue as well, doesn't it? So there's this, and the original, the Latin for tongue is lingua, which is where, of course, we get our word for language from as well. So there's this kind of strange idea of the foot being self-generating and even speaking almost as if it possesses Rufus and speaks through him. But the thing I wanted to close with is the following question for everyone to think about in terms of this ambiguity I was talking about at the beginning of this recording, which is there, I mean, it's difficult to answer this, but it's something to think about, is there more evil in deception of the type that Rufus does, or self-deception of the type that Sheppard indulges in? Which is worse? In what ways is one better than the other? So forth.
That's a great question. Yeah. I certainly don't think that it's clearly answered. I mean, the intelligence is in Rufus, who at least understands, and so in some sense, there's he's evil, and he does. I mean, in the sense that he gets pleasure, a kind of sociopathic pleasure from destroying, and especially, I mean, like, he is the type of character. I mean, it really is almost sociopathic in the sense that he understands Norton and Sheppard so well that he is able to find their wound and yet have no pity for it.
Yes. Yeah.
And that, either he's very angry about something and feels justified, as you were saying earlier, or he's sociopathic, or both. I don't know.
Yeah. So, any final thoughts on this remarkable? I mean, it is a remarkable little world that she creates.
Exactly. I mean, I think that that passage that I read, where Sheppard comes to this realization, I mean, it's dangerously close to an author's kind of gloss on the meaning of the story. I don't think that it actually is, whether Flannery O'Connor intended it to be or not. I think that, there is this kind of a way in which, the story seems to ask, why, this question about evil, and like the question, like you said, about who is worse, the person who's morally blind, or the person who is knowing but doing harm. And I mean, I think that religion seeks a kind of ratification through moral law of a purpose in our lives, and it seems to be that in that moment, it's almost as if there might be a purpose. If the purpose might be known, the moral law might be known, and the moral law might be, some version of Christian understanding of sin and redemption. But I don't think I think that the complexity of it's just like the gray tongue, and the foot, it any kind of attempt to encase it just grows expansively through any category that we attempt to fix on it. And so I think that you could certainly say that Sheppard is blind. He's blind to his own son's griefs, but there's crisscrossing and conflicting ways to interpret what he does as well.
Absolutely, and as they say, that's life, isn't it? I mean, this is the nature of trying to be good in an infinitely complicated, ambiguous, morally uncertain universe. Is very much a tall order,